Good evening and welcome. My name's Mike Fargione. I'm the manager of field research and outdoor programs at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, New York. If you're not familiar with Cary Institute, we are an independent ecological research and educational organization. We have scientists who study freshwaters and forests, urban ecosystems, and the ecologies of diseases. They work here in New York as well as around the world. This evening is the second of a 3-week forest stewardship workshop. Tonight, we're going to focus on threats to Northeast forests. In the final session next week, we'll be having a conversation about measuring the current health of your forest and setting goals and making plans. The workshop series is a collaborative project with Julie Hart of the Dutchess Land Conservancy, and it's always a pleasure to work with Julie, and we'll be hearing from her soon. Normally, we run this workshop as an all-day in-person event with indoor conversations and walks to view and compare different forests and hands-on fun activities. And we're hoping to get back to that next year. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, you'll see the chat feature. We'd love if you'd share with us who you are and where you're calling in from, and if you want a comment about your interest in forest stewardship. Once we start the presentations, we will be turning off the chat function. If you have questions, we ask you to type them in the Q&A feature. There'll be plenty of time at the end of the program where we'll try to answer all of your questions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Julie Hart.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Oops. All right. Can you see that okay? All right, thank you. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. As Mike said, this is our second in a 3-part webinar, an ecological approach to forest stewardship. So tonight we're covering threats to Northeast forests. And my name is Julie Hart. I'm an ecologist, and I'm a senior manager of stewardship and education at the Dutchess Land Conservancy. The Dutchess Land Conservancy's office is located actually just down the road from the Cary Institute. We have been working in Dutchess County for over 35 years. We're a small nonprofit land trust. And so over those years, we've protected over 43,000 acres of land in and around Dutchess County to protect the natural resources on those lands. And so it's a great pleasure to be a part of this webinar to bring the collective knowledge of the Cary Institute and the experience of both our organizations to hopefully allow us to talk a lot about forest stewardship and help you to understand the threats to the Northeast forests and what you yourself can do about those. As Mike said, next week we'll be talking more about the management aspect of it. So last week was kind of the introduction to ecological principles. Tonight, threats to forests, and next week we'll move on to the more in-depth management questions. So as Mike said, please feel free to type questions into the Q&A. And at the end of our presentations, we'll have plenty of time to go through questions. So tonight is session 2, threats to Northeast forests. So I'm going to start off with a discussion about basically disturbances, natural and human-caused disturbances, impacts of development, habitat loss, and fragmentation. So first, let's start with natural disturbances. Now, the photos that I'm showing you here are all local photos. These are all things that have happened in the Hudson Valley or New York State. So some of the examples that we think of in terms of natural disturbances, things like fire. This is something, of course, you see a lot more of this out west, but we do have fires here in the Northeast as well. This particular one is, I believe this is the Minnewaska fire a few years ago on the western side of the Hudson River. We don't have huge forest fires in the Northeast very often. It's a much damper place than the West. The vegetation is quite different, but we do have some fires here. So that is certainly something that can happen in our area. Flooding and erosion is quite common. The topography of the Hudson Valley is a very rolling, hilly place with a lot of streams and valleys. And so this is a photo of some of the erosion that happened during Hurricane Irene. This was over in the Catskills. And if you were a resident of the Hudson Valley or Dutchess County during that time. You probably remember that storm. It was pretty disastrous. Also, what we're thinking about in terms of natural disturbance is things like wind throw. Now, this is when strong winds either tip up a tree, tip the root system out of the ground, or snap off the tree mid-trunk. This is a photo of the destruction in northern New York due to a microburst that took place in, I think it was 96 or 97. And a microburst, if you're not familiar with it, the damage looks a lot like a tornado, but with tornadoes, the winds are cyclonic. And with a microburst, they're straight line, almost a severe downdraft type of damage. It's real like hammer of the gods type of destruction. You can see something just kind of came down really hard on this forest. And ice damage is another thing that we have fairly frequently here in the Northeast. This is a photo from the 1998 ice storm that blanketed northern New York, southern Ontario, moved off into Vermont and New Hampshire. It was extremely destructive. So thinking about all these different types of natural disturbance, let's put that in the context of Aldo Leopold. So you're going to find that Mike and I both quote Aldo Leopold fairly frequently. We usually decide who gets to use which quote by arm wrestling. But, because of COVID, we couldn't do that. So it was a rock, paper, scissors tournament over Zoom. I'm sorry, I totally made that up. But yes, we both quote Aldo Leopold very frequently. And this quote, I think, says a lot about what one of the most important things to understand as a manager of land, as a steward of the land. Land health is the capacity for self-renewal in the soils, waters, plants, and animals that collectively comprise the land. So first of all, remember the land isn't just soil, it's all of the life that lives there, plants and animals combined. And I want you to keep this quote in mind when you're considering the natural disturbances that we just looked at and contrasting those with the human disturbances that we will explore in a moment, and think about how the forests are able to recover from them. So some human-caused disturbances, we've got impervious surfaces, pavement, roofs, all of those things that prevent water from infiltrating into the ground. This can lead to a great deal of erosion during heavy rain events. Landform changes. Remember in last week's webinar, we talked about the geologic history of our area and how our soils formed over thousands of years after the glacier retreated. So all of the land has been, growing in place for many millennia, and then for humans to come in with our bulldozers and move things around, you're disrupting layers that took millennia to form, and those can have really significant impacts. Pollution. This is a photo of a forest that was killed by acid rain, which is an environmental stressor that has actually been mitigated to a certain extent thanks to the Clean Air Act and the Clean Air Act amendments. And lastly, unsustainable forestry practices. This is a Google Earth photo of the Amazon. And you can see the kind of across the landscape clearing that's happening in this large contiguous forest. So thinking about those types of disturbance, think about how the land is able to, the capacity for self-renewal that Leopold talks about. Remember, nature has evolved over millions and millions of years. And so being able to recover from those natural disturbances is kind of programmed into the matrix, so to speak. And so nature is able to recover from those. It takes longer in some cases than in others. But the human-caused disturbances are generally more sudden in ecological terms, happening over much shorter timescales and involving the kind of changes that nature requires a great deal of time to adjust to and recover from. So another favorite Leopold quote, "Our tools are better than we are and grow better and faster than we do. They suffice to crack the atom, to command the tides, but they do not suffice for the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it." So, Leopold was kind of ahead of his time in a lot of ways. He was writing back in the 1940s, having seen a lot of erosion and destruction on lands in the West due to mostly overgrazing. But, thinking about the effects of humans and how they interacted with land is a big part of Leopold's writings. And so we find a lot of wisdom on there. And to live on a piece of land without spoiling it, I think, is a good goal for everyone to consider. So the disturbances that we've been talking about inevitably lead to change, but change is a perfectly natural thing. We talked about that a little bit last week. And so I want you to consider that whenever there is a change to an ecosystem, it's not all good and bad, one or the other. Some species that live there are going to benefit a lot from that change. Others might benefit a little bit. Some might not be affected at all. Some species will be harmed a little and others will be harmed a lot. And so anytime there's a change to a system, it's always good to consider which species are the winners, so to speak, and which are the losers. So think about this in terms of ecological trade-offs. Who is going to benefit from the change and who is going to not benefit from the change? So let's go through a couple examples of this just to show you what I'm talking about. So first we have the example of a beaver dam. Now, beaver dams are pretty common in our area. Historically, beavers were a dominant force in the Northeast landscape. They were hunted almost to extinction during the 1700s, and by the 1800s, there were virtually none left. There was a point in time when there were no beavers in New York. They were reintroduced, I forget exactly when, about a century ago, I think, and have become, a feature of our landscape. So they do create change. There are a lot of humans who don't like this because when beavers change things, it might impact the humans to a great degree. So there's always a little bit of difficulty there. But let's think about the ecological considerations of this beaver dam. So when a beaver comes in and dams up a stream and creates a pond or a lake, some species are going to benefit from that. This great blue heron is going to find a lot more hunting grounds in the shallows around the edge. This painted turtle is going to find some lovely places to sun itself, and it'll have a fairly safe system to live in. Whereas other species will be harmed. This white oak has been girdled by the beavers, chewing the bark off of it. And even if it hadn't been, it would have drowned due to the water inundation of its root system. This chipmunk's not going to die because the waters didn't come up that quickly, but it's going to have to move. This is an animal that probably might have lived in a little crevice underneath that tree. It's going to have to move to higher ground. Similarly, this ovenbird is a ground nester. And so if it nested, in a place where the beaver dam caused an inundation, it's going to have to move. If it comes back next year, it'll have to go to higher ground to make its nest. So another example is fragmentation. Now, fragmentation is something that we want to spend a fair bit of time on, and it's basically the kind of cutting up of the landscape. So you can see that at one time, this area was probably entirely forested. And over time, it's been developed in different ways. There's some small lot developments and some larger lot developments, but basically it's kind of like a patchwork now. It's not a contiguous system anymore. And so some species are going to benefit from this. Those deer and mice love that kind of patchwork habitat. It gives them a lot of places to live and a lot of things to eat. Other species are going to be harmed. This bobcat and fisher tend to need larger patches of forest in order to survive. They're hunters, so they need a fairly large area to cover where they'll be able to find the prey that they need to survive. So let's dive deeper a little bit into the fragmentation idea. This is a photo of somewhere in Dutchess County. I couldn't tell you exactly where, and I do apologize if you recognize your house in there somewhere. This is not meant to be putting anybody on the spot. This is kind of what our whole landscape looks like in this area. You can see it's a patchwork. You can see there are some farm fields, some wetlands, some forests, houses, and roads, and there are a lot of different habitat types here. So animals that can survive and benefit in those smaller patches are going to do just fine. Things that need a much larger contiguous patch of forest are going to have some difficulties. So going back to the history, which we talked about last week, this is just a review of that. This is some wonderful research that was done by Harvard Forest. So let me just walk you through this graph because there is a lot here. So each one of these lines represents a state in New England. They don't consider New York to be part of New England, sorry. But the general trends are the same in New York. So as you can see, in 1600, the vast majority of the landscape was forested, up to 90% in most areas. And then as the settlers came in, especially through the 17 and early 1800s, the landscape was largely deforested. The trees were cut down to create farmlands. They needed the wood to build houses and for firewood. And so this bottomed out around 1850 when some states were down to only about 30% forest cover. So huge change. And over time, as those farms were abandoned, the forest cover started to come back. But what I want to draw your attention to is you can see around 1950, the overall forest cover starts to decline again. And in this case, that is mostly due to human development, to buildings and malls and homes being built, lots of roadways going in. And so while the initial decline on this graph was caused by cutting trees for farmland, when the farmlands were abandoned, the forests came back. In this case, the more recent clearing has been done for human development. And so that's an area where trees are less likely to come back. There's impervious surfaces, there's landform changes, there'll be impediments to those areas turning back into forest because people live there now. So here's another area of Dutchess County. I won't tell you exactly where. What I want you to notice is on the left side of the screen is the aerial photo from 1936. So if you look at this carefully, you can see it's almost entirely open fields. There's a little bit of a wetland complex down in the bottom right-hand side, but mostly this is farm fields. You can see the little dot matrix pattern that's orchards where the apple trees are very obviously planted there. On the right side is the photo from probably 2016. And you can see this is the exact same area in Dutchess County, but you can see over time, the area has been changed a lot. The farmland has been abandoned, started to grow back into forest, but now there's a lot of subdivisions there. There's a lot of human development. And so this is a classic example of fragmentation. You can see what a patchwork that landscape is. And so the result of that from a wildlife perspective is habitat loss and loss of connectivity. So as we talked about before, the loss of habitats for animals that need those larger areas to be able to find the prey that they need or whatever it is that they eat. And the loss of connectivity affects the movement of animals. So, humans tend to live in one house, but sometimes we move to someplace else. And animals do the same thing. They're not always in the same spot on the landscape. So due to the seasons or moving, in response to prey availability, animals, wildlife that's on the land needs to be able to move from one area to another. And so if you're a forest dwelling creature, and maybe you live in this forest patch at the bottom of the screen, what if you run out of whatever prey you were eating there? You need to find another forest patch, but there's a lot of big fields in the way. So that's what we mean by loss of connectivity. These larger patches of forest are not connected. So that's a big part of what land conservation is focusing on these days is the connectivity, protecting contiguous parcels so that we can maintain as much connectivity as we can for the ecological stability of that habitat. So some species are going to thrive in those fragmented ecosystems, like we talked about, the deer and the mice just love it there. There's actually increased habitat. They like that forest field interface, those edge habitats. And there's also more food available because the things that they eat grow naturally in greater quantities around those forest field interfaces, those edges. And also very few predators. The major predators in our Northeast forests were exterminated centuries ago. And so the major predator for deer, for example, is cars. So these ecological changes, allowed these particular species to thrive. Other key species, due to this fragmentation, are declining or lost entirely. The wolves and the mountain lions that used to be the top predators in our area are largely gone, although not entirely. And native pollinators also are suffering because of the loss of native species. So there's a great example that the Cary Institute has worked on of looking at kind of the interconnection of the food web and the landscape, their Lyme disease research. So we talked about this a little bit last week, but here's a nice graphic representation that shows you that, when the oak trees produce a lot of acorns, it's a great food source for the mice and chipmunks and deer, so their populations can increase. And then when the populations, especially of the mice and chipmunks, increase, they are vectors for the black-legged tick, which carries Lyme disease, among other parasites as well. So, think of this as another way of looking at the landscape, these interconnections on this food web. This is something that affects humans directly because we are so susceptible to Lyme disease. So that's one way of looking at the food web of the biodiversity that's on the land. And here's another way that I like to think about the ecological communities of the land is this. What do all of these things have in common? Just think about this for a second. The answer is they all have layers. If the chicken confused you, chickens are layers. So same thing, right? So these things all have layers, and the land has layers too. So Aldo Leopold and ecologists refer to this as the biotic pyramid. And so at the base is soil. Next, the primary producers, otherwise known as plants. And then there's the things that eat the plants, the herbivores. Then there's the things that eat both plants and herbivores, the omnivores. And then the carnivores at the top that are eating those other organisms. And at the very top is the apex predators. And so that's what we call the biotic pyramid. And think about those as the functional levels of the food web. In biology, we would call it trophic levels. Basically, it's what does it eat? So the soil being kind of the basis for everything, plants growing out of that, things are eating plants, and then other animals are eating the animals that eat the plants, and so on up the pyramid. So consider all of the different layers that occur on the land in terms of the functionality of the ecosystem. It is life piled on life, as Tennyson has this wonderful phrase in his poem, Ulysses. The poem didn't have anything to do with ecological functions, obviously. I just think it's a cool phrase that really describes the complex biodiversity of the land. So as Leopold says, much better than I could, land then is not merely soil. It's a fountain of energy flowing through a circuit of soils, plants, and animals. So remember that biological pyramid that we just looked at. Leopold's describing it as a fountain of energy, and that's literally what it is. As these plants and animals die, they decay back into the soil, and the cycle continues. But when humans are impacting the landscape, we tend to produce these sort of simplified, less functional systems. So, we plant trees in rows and they're all the same species. That's not how forests typically grow. So there's less functionality there, there's less diversity. Similarly, we might dig out a pond from a wetland. So a wetland is a complex layered system with a lot of biodiversity. A lot of things live in ponds too, but they're much more simplified systems. And so another Leopold quote, I hope you'll forgive me. Due to these disturbances, the land recovers, but at some reduced level of complexity and with a reduced carrying capacity for people, plants, and animals. So that's Leopold's way of describing the impacts of disturbance, both natural and human, on the land. It recovers, but it has a reduced level of complexity. So let's move on to the invasive species that we want to focus on tonight. And Mike will be talking about the impacts of deer after this. But let's, for the moment, focus on the pests and pathogens that are affecting our forests. So this is a map showing the number of forest pests, the number of imported forest pests that occur in each state in the United States. And so I would just like to point out here that New York is number one. Yay, us. That is not a great thing to be number one at, but it stands as a valid statistic. New York has a lot of ports and a lot of trade, and that's how a lot of these insects and pests and pathogens are coming in to our area. The damage is enormous. The cumulative detections of imported pests, you can see, has increased exponentially, not quite exponentially, but greatly over the decades as more and more of these pests and pathogens are found in our area. And the economic costs are just incredible. If you think about local governments who are responsible for street trees, public lands, every time a new forest pest sweeps through an area, there's a lot of dead and dying trees that need to be dealt with. So think about a local government that had, let's say, a lot of elm trees lining their streets, which many, many towns did a century ago. Well, most of those elm trees succumbed to Dutch elm disease and had to be removed. So any local government that replaced them with white ash tree is in a real pickle now because the ash trees are all dying from emerald ash borer. And so it's kind of this, wave after wave of these pests and pathogens that come into our area. And the Cary Institute has a wonderful program, Tree Smart Trade, which is fighting the importation of forest pests with actual policy, education, and action. And so through a lot of initiatives, working on pest-free packing materials, rapid response programs, other prevention programs, and restricting importations of live plants, which is one of the large sources of these introduced pests, and the wooden packing materials that a lot of products are imported in, the wooden pallets and so forth. So a lot of wood-boring insects arrive in that form. So to find out more, go to treesmarttrade.org. There's a lot of great information there. So let's jump into invasive species. I'm sorry, this is not a forest pest. I just want to stress that this is a sea lamprey. But I think it really kind of pictorially says what you really are all thinking about invasive species, which is they just latch on and won't let go. So it's a great pictorial representation. So what makes a species invasive? Well, if you ask 10 different ecologists, you'll get 10 different answers. But the basics are the invasive species are competing with natives for resources, water, sunlight, pollinators, things like that. They are able to reproduce rapidly and spread over large areas. And there's not a lot of controls on their populations. So remember when we looked at that pyramid of land of biodiversity, you had those trophic levels. And so if you have a plant from a place in Asia where it has herbivores that eat it, it has insects and maybe some ungulates that eat that particular plant, and it's co-evolved like that for millennia. But if you bring that plant here, maybe those insects aren't here, maybe those ungulates aren't here. And so there's no control on that population. It can just explode. So I want to stress that invasives are not evil. We do have a tendency, humans are such a clannish bunch, and we're always, if you're not with me, you're against me. And we have this tendency to lump anything that's not from around here as an invasive alien and call it an evil thing. And that's really not the case. There are some that are harmful, but not all alien species are invasive because they don't meet these definitions. Maybe they don't reproduce rapidly and spread over large areas. Maybe the natives are able to compete with them. So there's a lot of variability in gray areas in terms of these definitions. So I would urge some caution in terms of what you're identifying as an invasive species. And we'll point you towards some resources later. But what else makes a species invasive? Well, it causes harm. That's the kind of invasive that really gets our attention. It's causing either ecological or economic harm, sometimes both, and it's altering the structure and function of these complex ecological communities. So by its presence, it is interrupting the food web in some way or another. And by doing that, it may cause the decline or extinction of native species. So the overall definition is very difficult. You're not really going to find the definition of invasive species anywhere because it's very subjective. But to me, the most important thing about what makes a species invasive is, does it disrupt the food web? Is it something that is outcompeting the natives to the extent that, it's covering the ground, and so seeds from native species just can't get the light that they need to be able to sprout? Is it something like the tree communities where, in the springtime, you have a lot of caterpillars that hatch out? And we think of caterpillars as something that we might not want to have on our trees, but actually caterpillars are usually great unless there are way too many of them. But generally they exist at levels that are just reasonable and not harmful to the tree at all. So Doug Tallamy has a wonderful book called Bringing Nature Home. And this is one of the facts that he gives us, is that native plants support 35% more caterpillar biomass than alien plant species. And why do you care about this? Like I said, most people don't really like caterpillars at all. They tend to squish them. But who does like caterpillars? Nesting songbirds, because those baby birds really need caterpillars. Remember, fruits and seeds don't exist yet. It's too early in the season. They need that protein and fat for those chicks to grow rapidly so that they can be ready to fledge and fly the nest in their time. So caterpillars are one of the most in need food sources for those nesting songbirds. So keep that in mind, that even things that you don't like caterpillars, are food for something that you do like those songbirds that come to your feeder all winter long. So going back to this Aldo Leopold quote about the circuit of energy, the invasive species are disrupting that circuit. And the Talamy book that I just referenced was a real eye-opener for me because, when we kind of progress through the summer and into the fall, the trees always just look, their foliage just looks kind of tired and depleted, and it's just chewed up by all different kinds of things. It's chewed and torn. And after reading Doug Talamy's book, I realized, no, that's actually a good thing. The carbon and nutrients from those leaves has become part of the body of whatever caterpillar ate it, which then became part of the chicks of these songbirds that I love to watch. And so those slightly, tattered looking trees at the end of the summer, hey, they've done their job. They haven't just made enough energy for the tree itself, but they have also been a critical component of that food web, where they have supported those insect populations, which have supported the bird populations and other small mammal populations. So always think of the interconnectedness of that, the circuit of energy flowing through the soils, plants, and animals. So what we're doing is giving you some general background on these invasive species. I know you'll probably have a lot of questions about specific species. We'll handle those as best we can, but the honest answer to management questions is always, it depends. So in order to give you a real answer, we'd probably have to go to your property, look at your trees, and that's just not something that we're able to do for all of you. So we can send you to some resources that will give you a lot of information that you need about these pests and pathogens. So these are all things that are either currently impacting in a big way or have the potential to impact our area in a big way. On the left, we've got insects, pests that have been imported from other areas. And on the right, we have pathogens. These are diseases that trees can get in our area. So each of these has caused varying amounts of damage and destruction, and in a lot of different ways. So when these pests and pathogens affect the trees, they are reducing the livelihood of the trees, basically the health of those trees, which reduces habitat for a lot of other organisms as well. Remember, all of those trees are food sources. Tree seeds are a very common source of food for all kinds of birds and small mammals. And so decreased health of the trees is going to decrease food availability for a lot of other organisms in the system. And as the trees die back due to whatever pest or pathogen is affecting them, there's less cover for wildlife to be able to avoid predators. So also, along with the forest pests and pathogens, we have a lot of invasive plant species that affect forests in various different ways. Some of these you find mostly at the edges of forests. Some of them you might find in the interior. These are mostly things that you'll find in the forest understory, in the example of the barberry or the garlic mustard, vines climbing up the trees like the wisteria and the bittersweet. Phragmites, I guess, isn't really a forest pest. I probably should have put a different photo in there. But these are all really impactful invasive plant species that have invaded our areas to various degrees. And what are they doing? They're also changing the habitat quality. Things like garlic mustard have what's called allelopathic properties, where the roots are actually exuding toxic substances into the soil that prevents other plants from growing in that area. So those invasive plants can have a fairly widespread impact. It can change the food availability and quality. Some of these shrubs produce fruits that are eaten by birds. It's considered a food source for birds. But studies show that those fruits are not necessarily as nutritious as the native species that we have. And so the birds would have to eat more of them in order to get the nutritional value that they need to function. As we said before, of course, invasive plants are also competing with native plants, and these impacts are cascading through the food web. So this problem is always kind of moving through the system, through the different elements of those trophic levels that we looked at with the Biotic Pyramid. So I'm just going to run through some very basic advice on invasives management, just to give you some guidelines on how to go about this. So firstly, identify what you have. If you can identify it to the species, you can find out, is it really an invasive, or is it something that just kind of looks like one of the invasive species that we have? So 10 years ago, I would have been referring you to all kinds of field guides, but hey, everybody's got a smartphone. Even I got one now. So there's some great apps out there. iNaturalist and Seek are two of my favorites. You just point your cell phone camera at the plant and it'll tell you what the species is. So identify what species you have, determine if they're invasive, and then learn about management methods. We have a great resource here in the Hudson Valley, the Lower Hudson PRISM, which is the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. If you go to their website, lhprism.org, they have tons of resources there on management of all different invasives. They've got a wonderful chemical-free management guide that you can refer to if you don't like using chemicals. And make a plan and set realistic goals based on what you learn when you're researching your management methods. I would urge you to forget the word eradicate because most of the invasive species that you have on your property are probably things that have been here for quite some time. You can't really get rid of them because if you pull out the ones that you have, you know, half a mile down the road, there's another stand of multiflora rose or barberry, and the birds are just going to keep on eating those seeds and pooping them out, and they will come back. A lot of those seeds can survive for years in the soil seed bank. So set realistic goals. Don't try to get rid of everything because you probably can't do that. So keep your goals realistic and make them stepwise. Prioritize, pick your battles. Start with one part of your property or start with one species and work on that. Don't try to solve the whole problem at once because you'll get so overwhelmed, you'll probably give up. Invasives are everywhere here and they have varying levels of impact. Some of them are probably fine to leave as they are. Others of them, you know, for aesthetic or ecological reasons, you might want to remove. But you have to really pick your battles. Commit to making progress, not winning. You know, maybe take a series of photos or make a map of your property and show where are the things that you want to work on and keep track of that. You know, keep a journal or a diary about your progress because then you can look back and see that you are making progress. You know, you're never going to get to a point where you say, look, there's no more invasives on my property because that's really, really unlikely. There's just too many of them. So commit to making progress and not winning. And as a guide, here's a curve that was put together, USDA and the Invasive Species Council, that shows you kind of the level of management that you should consider. So on the x-axis, we're looking at time, and this is basically time from species introduction. So when a species is introduced, it's in small numbers in a small area. And if it can be identified at that point, eradication actually is possible, but only during that stage. Because it's an invasive species, it will rapidly increase. And so over time, it's going to get to the point where you can't eradicate it, but you might be able to contain it to a certain degree. And then as time goes by and the species numbers increase, you have no choice but to just work on long-term management. And so I'm going to leave you with a couple of maps from the Nature Conservancy, looking at the overall ability of our forests in New York to regenerate. And this is something Mike's going to talk about more in his section on deer management. So I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Julie. Great job. I will share my screen now. Okay. We're almost there. All right, here we go. So tonight I'm going to focus more on some of the threats, as Julie has mentioned, and I'm trying to move this out of the way so we can see. Okay. I'm going to talk about deer and impacts deer have, overabundant deer have on forests, and then how invasive plants can take advantage of conditions resulting from deer overbrowsing. And then finally, we'll consider some of the implications of deciding not to manage our private forests and potentially what impacts that could have. First, I do want to review a few of the concepts that we covered last week as well. So we see today that the forests we look at here are not the same as the forests of yesteryear. As ecologists consider today's forests, they repeatedly come to the same conclusion that our forests today are not the same as what existed in the past, that today's forests are constantly changing, and the forests of the future will look different than what we see today. So I'd like to ask you to keep that in mind um, as you move through and walk through forests in your next visit. Consider what sites might have looked like 100 years ago or even 300 years ago, and try and imagine the processes that shaped those forests to make them look the way you see them today. It's an exercise that actually is a terrific way to be able to understand how our forests have changed and how we can be better stewards. The plant communities we see today resulted from many processes. Julie talked about some of them, like past climate, the way plants disperse and establish themselves, plant competition, and succession of species that dominate a site and then change over time. Julie also did a great job of talking about natural and man-made disturbances, including the legacy of past land use by humans. Plants differ in how they establish themselves and survive, and these differences can shape forest communities. The amount of light they require is different, their nutrient and soil fertility needs, how much water they require and how much water they're able to tolerate, their capacity to survive different climatic conditions. All of these things help plants to differentiate themselves and compete for resources with their neighbors. Their different adaptations and life history strategies result in some winners and some losers, and the process, again, is shaping our forests. Light, in particular, is a critical factor that influences which plants have the advantage over time. They differ in their shade tolerance. So bare ground or a grassy meadow, like you see in the photo on the left, can provide ample amounts of sunlight if a plant can get there and become established. Trees that require full sun are often species that have tiny windblown seeds that increase their chance of being the first ones on the scene. In the center photo, we see that as trees grow, they change their immediate environment by reducing the amount of light that reaches the ground. And this change in light availability provides new advantages for more shade-tolerant trees that arrive, helping them to start to outcompete their neighbors. As trees grow and fill space, their leaf canopies capture more light, giving advantage to the most shade-tolerant tree seedlings on the forest floor. So competition for light leads again to winners and losers among the tree species, and they result in a gradual change or succession of different plants that dominate a site over time. Julie did a nice job of talking about disturbances, both natural and man-made, and how those disturbances can revert forests back to an earlier stage in succession, or depending on the kind of disturbance, may actually remove those sites from ecological communities when it's commercial or residential development, such as paving over an area. When disturbances do happen, they create a void or a gap that allows plant succession to begin again. And the gaps, as Julie showed us, can be as small as a single plant or can cover many, many miles. If the disturbance is large enough and other conditions have changed over time, this disturbance will result in the formation of a different community than what was there originally. And that's exactly what's been taking place here in the Northeast over the last 300 years. And it's what's continuing to happen today. So again, this is a classic depiction of how plant succession could take place over time, starting from bare soil and ending up at a climax forest community. And again, disturbance can change the path of succession and set it back to one of the previous stages. You'll see the bars above the illustrations of the different plants with bird names. And that's to remind us that other organisms, fungi, the insects, the birds, the mammals, the herps, They're all part of these communities, and these animal species will change as the forest structure changes. These parts of the community are all interconnected. Wildlife primarily require appropriate and adequate amounts of food, water, and cover for hiding and feeding and raising their young. And while these needs are met is a reflection of different soils, topography, and climate, but most importantly, it's a reflection of the plants found in an area and how they're distributed across the landscape. The more different habitat types you might have on your land, the more different types of wildlife you're likely to find there. In addition to many different habitats, you can have different complexity of a single habitat, as seen in the photo on the left, where you have a dense understory, mid-canopy tree species, and then an upper canopy of mature trees. This complex habitat can support more wildlife species than would be found in a simpler habitat. On the right, you can see some drawings that demonstrate how 3 common bird species found in our area might divide up and use different parts of a complex habitat, like you see on the left side. So in the top of the illustration, you see eastern wood peewees, which are eastern wood peewees, which are a flycatcher, will nest in the upper canopy of a forest, but will do most of their foraging in the mid-canopy area. In contrast to that, the black-throated green warbler does most of its nesting in the mid to lower parts of the canopy, but will forage in the upper parts of the trees. And the veery, which is a member of the thrush family, does most of its foraging in the middle parts of the canopy and nests close to the ground. So the absence of any of these layers, the understory, the mid-canopy, or the upper story, would reduce the value of this particular habitat for the species in which needs that particular layer. And overall, a simpler habitat would decrease bird diversity in such a forest. So let's move now forward and talk about the impacts deer are having on forests here in the Northeast. Deer are considered to be keystone species because they have a disproportionately large effect on their environment. We can look at deer ecology to understand why they have such impacts. White-tailed deer are a long-lived species. They can reproduce at a young age with good habitat and available food sources. Even fawns are able to breed. They have what's known as a polygamous breeding system, which means that one male can service or breed with numerous females. They thrive in post-agricultural landscapes that are very common here in the Northeast, and they can live very easily close to people. And in fact, there are more deer today than were in the area before European settlers arrived here in the Northeast. Studies have shown that deer populations are capable of doubling in about 2.5 years if there's an absence of significant mortality. The classic study of wildlife deer population growth took place at a place called the George Reserve in Michigan. In 1928, 6 deer were placed inside a 1,300-acre fenced enclosure. And within 7 years, that deer population grew to 222 animals. Dr. Dale McCulloch, who conducted one of the wildlife profession's classic deer studies, eliminated all but 10 deer inside that fence in 1974. And then he followed the population's growth and productivity. And the population rebounded to 212 animals in just 6 years. So we see the fecundity of this species and its ability to increase its population rapidly in the absence of significant mortality. Deer have demonstrated food preferences. They select plants based on their nutritional needs, depending on the season. If there are too many deer, when they are selectively feeding, they can reduce and even eliminate preferred browse species. Often cited examples of their impacts related to food preferences are the loss of some native wildflowers in areas where there are abundant and overabundant deer. Winter and early spring are the time of greatest hardship for northern whitetails. It's been calculated that a single adult deer would have to consume about 6 pounds of twigs each day to maintain its body weight here in New York during our typical winters. And you can imagine the amount of effort and the amount of buds it would take to equal 6 pounds. So browsing by too many deer results in widespread damage to tree seedlings, which are the hope for the next forest. And the photos here show a deer locally in winter and an oak seedling that has been browsed upon, that you can look at each of the various twigs on that seedling and see that the end buds have been removed by deer as they tried to consume enough energy to make it through the winter. When we look at forests, we often look right past the lower levels as we're marveling at the mature trees in the background. But the mid-canopy, and particularly the understory, the lowest layer, are overlooked and undervalued in the role they provide in supporting wildlife and providing future forests for us. Park-like forests, as you see in the left photo, are the results of years and years of overabundant deer populations. Such forests have less food and cover for deer and for other wildlife compared with the healthy forest you see in the right photo. So overabundant deer will shift plant species and the structure of the forest in ways that alter their communities for years and generations. Deer damage is extensive here in the Northeast. In 2009, Cornell researchers did a survey where they contacted foresters in New York State and asked them what were barriers to regenerating forests naturally here in the state. And across the state, foresters reported that regeneration was successful on less than a third of the forests they worked in. Most stands they worked in had marginal or failed regeneration. And as you can see from this list, the most frequently reported cause of the failures of regeneration in forests was due to deer browsing. 81% of the respondents said that deer browsing was the primary reason that their forests failed to regenerate. Numerous studies have examined the growth of deer populations and the impacts of different deer populations. It's been suggested that more than 10 deer per square mile can lower the abundance of preferred browse species of plants. Levels of 15 deer per square mile can impair forest regeneration. Many parts of the Northeast have estimates of 30 to 50 deer per square mile. That's a very common range of numbers that we see here in the Northeast. There are some sites where there are estimates that deer numbers may reach or exceed 100 deer per square mile. If you think about that, those numbers are really astounding when you consider that pre-colonial time, the number of deer that were thought to be here was around 10 deer per square mile. Food quality and availability do play a role in the impacts deer have on forests. If you look at these two photographs, the top photo has a lot more diversity of plants and habitats than the bottom photo, which is primarily old forests. So areas with greater habitat diversity will have more food and potentially can support more deer than the thresholds you see in the table on the left. So those are thresholds that are suggested. You can get deer numbers that exceed those and still have healthy communities if you have adequate levels of food of other kinds. The deer forest situation really does seem dire here in the Northeast. And Julie showed this slide, and I want to touch on it a little bit more in depth. The Nature Conservancy published a study in 2010 that talked about the potential for forests to regenerate here in New York. The regrowth of desirable trees was in doubt in many areas. This map illustrates those findings. Areas that are in dark green have very good potential for forest regeneration. Those in light green have adequate potential. Orange sites are fair, and the red has a very poor potential for forest regrowth. You can see the region here in the southeast of New York where we're located is got an awful lot of orange and red in it and is really a crisis area when it comes to forest regeneration. In addition to having impacts on regenerating forests, studies have also looked at the impacts too many deer have on other wildlife populations. A variety of different results have been reported. Things like reductions in the number of insects and insect species where deer are too abundant, fewer mid-story nesting birds. Other studies reported fewer birds that fed or nested near the ground. There were greater impacts on birds that used mature forests than early successional forests. Places where there were deer were excluded, had more small mammals like chipmunks and mice. So we can see lots of impacts that we don't fully understand of too many deer impacting the vegetation and spillover of those impacts into the other plants and animals that make up parts of the community. There's also an increasing body of research that shows there are relationships between overabundant deer and the dominance of invasive plants. Examples of such relationships have been reported for things like garlic mustard and Japanese stiltgrass. In some cases, invasive plants have proposed to actually help to increase deer numbers. In one study, it seemed like they suggested that invasive plants leafed out earlier and provided nutrition that deer needed at a critical time, and that this then allowed deer populations to expand. As with any area of new research, there are different studies and the reports are sometimes contradictory to each other, but in many cases, the results are pretty much too many deer means too fewer native plants and more successful introductions of non-native plants. I found the quote here on the left, and I thought it was a useful description of the relationship between deer and invasive plants and the lead role that deer play as a keystone species. Deer are key drivers of community change, while invasive plants are likely passengers, opportunistically taking advantage of ecosystem alterations. So deer drive the changes and invasive plants are likely to be taking advantage of those changes where they can. This was interesting. Another possible threat to our forests I just learned about related to accelerated climate change and the interactions with some of these threats we've already talked about. Warming temperatures, but particularly increases in precipitation, is resulting in shifting ranges for some of our forest species. So the figure you see on the right illustrates how different groups of trees are changing their ranges during this study period that they were looking at. So there are little blue arrows that show where a population of a particular tree species has been expanding its range mostly to the west and sometimes to the north. So we can expect as climate changes, the ranges of different plants will change with it, and plants will move in directions that will allow them to be successful where they can find conditions that are suitable, and they will probably drop away from those areas that become unsuitable. But the interesting thing was that human-caused stresses like competition from invasive plants and the loss of seedlings due to deer browsing and changes in land use like agricultural practices are actually believed to be creating a barrier that may prevent plants from being able to change the zones where they survive. They may actually be preventing some plants from moving from southern areas to more northern areas, even though climatic conditions north of their range are becoming more favorable. So the map you see at the right shows an illustration of an area that potentially is becoming a barrier to the movement, the range expansion of native trees here in Eastern New York or Eastern North America. You can see that band of blue kind of runs through Virginia and Maryland, Pennsylvania, southeastern New York, and then right up through the coastal areas of southern New England. The prediction is this barrier may lead to long-term declines in forest cover and may actually impede the northern migration of different tree populations. So clearly there's much to learn about how all these factors play out in our forests, and we will continue to learn about these things as scientists study them. But it's worth considering these impacts now as we learn about them. Finally, I want to mention the possibility that there's one more threat to our forests. And what I'm thinking about here is the threat that we, as stewards, will not take on the task of actively managing our forest lands. There are many reasons why people may be hesitant to become active managers. They may be unsure what to do. Yes, it's complicated. They may not want to make a mistake, or they may feel they can't afford to do it all right away. Sometimes people feel like it's better to let nature take its course. There are a number of reasons, I think, why it makes sense to try and consider, at least, being active managers of our forests. There are no pristine forest communities here in the Northeast for the most part. They are all transitioning towards a different type of community based on past human disturbances. The disturbances we see today are not what produced our pre-colonial forests. We've reduced some disturbances like fires and beaver flooding, but we've introduced others at alarming rates like the pests and pathogens that Julie talked about. Change is already happening. It will continue regardless of if you take actions or not. And I'd like to ask you, do you like the current direction of that change in your forests? And many forests are moving towards homogeneous, simpler, and less diverse states. They're less able to support other wildlife and to withstand catastrophic disturbances. So we should recognize that letting nature take its course is also a management decision, and we should be prepared for the impacts of those. So if you want to be a good forest steward and you want to consider actively managing your forest, what do you do? Well, that's our topic for next session. We're going to be talking about healthy forests, developing management plans, and various aspects of being a hands-on forest steward. So I will stop sharing there, and Julie and I will try to answer any questions you have.
All right, let me get the Q&A up. So we've already got some great questions here. So first of all, from Carol, any suggestions for getting rid of autumn olive, which is replacing dogwoods and viburnums? Ooh, autumn olive is a tough one. So do you have anything specific on that, Mike?
I would say for the particular species of invasive plants, the best thing to do would be to visit a site like the Lower Hudson Prism, where they have best management practices in written form. I wouldn't want to give chemical recommendations without having checked them. I think it can vary between states. It can also vary at times of year. And so it's really the kind of information you'd want to look at in detail in a written document, I think.
Okay, and there's another question. This one's on phenology. So can we address the importance of phenology, when to manage for optimal success and without further spread? So this person is currently working on honeysuckle, multiflora rose, and garlic mustard, and is interested in knowing, when do I need to stop? So that's an interesting question. So phenology, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of the study of major events in the life cycle of organisms. So you hear it commonly in terms of plants. So someone tracking the phenological records of a certain plant would be noting, on what day each year does it flower, on what day do the leaves start to expand. So that's what we mean when we're talking about phenology, those kind of seasonal characteristics that appear during the year. And so I think what you're getting at here is, do you need to do the particular times of the year when it's optimal to manage invasive species? And I think a general answer is before it goes to seed. Would you agree with that, Mike?
Yeah, that would certainly be the best time if you're going to try and remove plants, to treat them before they go to seed, so you don't have that new seed input into the seed bank. But again, with all of these plants, controlling them, the best way to do it depends on the particular species, and you really should be looking into details of how to control that species. If you're using chemical controls, there are different timings of year that work better than others. If you're using mechanical means, again, it may depend on the season.
Mm-hmm. And that segues into another question on garlic mustard, um, which is, I've read that pulling it up by the roots is not advised since it disturbs soil and exposes the seeds. Should I be concerned about that? And so there's a couple things. So first of all, disturbing the soil is definitely a way to introduce more invasive species. That's where you tend to get that kind of invasion of invasive species, is in places where the soils are disturbed. However, I had reason to look this up recently. And so I can tell you that on the Lower Hudson Prism website, they actually advise pulling garlic mustard out by the roots. They say if you leave the root in place, it'll resprout from the taproot. And so in this case, they do advise pulling it up by the root. I would also point out that garlic mustard makes great pesto. So that's another way to control invasive species, if you're up for it, is try eating some of them.
Another thing about garlic mustard is they produce large volumes of seeds. And so when you pull them up by the root, you may be removing that plant, but you got to be careful not to get discouraged, because you will have new plants showing up probably for the next 5 to 7 years, if it's an established planting of them or established plot of them, because there's that many seeds in the seed bank, and it will take that long for the remaining seeds there to germinate. So don't be discouraged if you have to do hand pulling for quite a few years.
Yeah, and I've read that seeds like the rose hips that you get from multiflora rose can survive in the seed bank for up to 20 years. So they do persist. So there's a follow-up question from the phenology asking, so while they're flowering would be okay? And I think the answer to that is yes. If you can cut or brush hog those shrubs or plants while they're flowering, you're going to prevent them from going to seed. So absolutely. And you and a follow-up from the garlic mustard question, we are definitely eating it. So congratulations to you. It does make good pesto. I made some last week. Let's see. Is it bad to have a garden of invasive species or plant them in the forest? So I think one of the first things we should differentiate here is the difference between an invasive species and an alien species. And so just as an example, we used to have a native plant gardener at the Cary Institute. And I remember her going to someone's house and looking at the flower beds and just walking down going, alien, 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 alien. A lot of what we plant in our flower beds are alien species. That doesn't mean that they're invasive. And so if they're just going to stay in your flower bed, if they're not really prone to seeding all over the place, they are probably okay, at least in terms of the fact that they're not multiplying themselves across the landscape. But what you also want to consider is these alien species are not necessarily plugged into our local food web. So most insects are extremely selective about what they eat. And we don't really think about this very much. We think, oh, they're just bugs, they eat stuff. But in fact, most species of insects can only eat one species of plant or perhaps one genus of plant types. And so it's because over time they have evolved with that plant so that their digestive system has the chemicals that it needs to be able to break it down. And so if they're not able to find that native plant, then the species will decline. I think monarch butterflies is the very classic example of that, where they require that milkweed plant in order for the caterpillars to be able to eat it. So it's not bad to have a garden of alien species If they are invasive, you definitely want to stay away from them. And the difficulty is that nurseries and garden centers sell a lot of plants that are not native. It doesn't necessarily mean they're invasive, but it is important to keep that in mind. It puts a lot of burden on you. You do need to do some research when you're plant shopping. And you know what? Those phone apps like Seek are great. You can just be at the nursery and point your phone at the plant, and it'll tell you if it's a native species or not. But in general, it's if you can find them and if you can afford to go to the specific native species nurseries, those are the species that will be able to interact with our local biodiversity and support the local food webs. Okay. Let's see. Recommendations, tips, and advice about reforesting areas of hayfields and farmlands.
I think the key here is to think about your goals and what you hope to accomplish with it, and then use those goals to direct the kinds of management plan and activities you're going to do. So if you're looking to produce wildlife for viewing or for hunting or some other reason, it may require different management than if you're looking to increase pollinators or insect diversity. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, but I think clear understanding of your own goals will help you to decide what kinds of management activities you want to do.
Mm-hmm. And to that, I would just add to start with some research. And I always go for the soil types because not every plant can grow everywhere. So look at what soil types you have. If you're in an area that's more upland, you might be growing more, oak and hickory trees versus if you have a stream or river nearby, you might be looking at more like sycamores and willows, things that don't mind having their feet wet. So look at your soil types before you start buying trees because you can't just plop a tree in the ground and expect it to be fine. And I would also remind folks to just kind of change your mindset when you are planting trees. There's a lot out there about planting trees. It's a great thing to do. I would just change that a little bit in your head. Think of what you're doing as growing trees. It's one thing to pop a seedling in the ground, but if you don't take care of it, it's going to need to be watered for a while. You're probably going to need to fence it so the deer don't eat it. It's kind of a long-term investment. Think of what you're doing as growing trees, not planting them, and do your research about what species would be able to survive in the area that you're looking at.
There's a question here, Julie, about using dogs for deer control or harassment. And so there's a couple of things about that. The first is actually letting your dog loose to chase deer is actually against the law, so definitely don't do that. There have been a number of methods that have been tested over the years to try and control deer damage, particularly in agricultural crops. And fruit growers have tried to use dogs with invisible fence is a brand, but containment fence systems where you have a wire around the perimeter and a collar on the dog, and the dog is trained to stay within the space. They have used those successfully to keep deer out of orchards. I will say it's a lot of work, and it may end up over many years, 20 years, costing you as much as actually putting up a tall fence around the area. So there are different methods that have been shown to work effectively to keep deer out of areas, but often the cost effectiveness is a different story.
All right, now here's a question on thoughts on the use of chemicals on invasives. This is someone working on a large, heavy barberry infestation. So I would again refer you to the Lower Hudson Prism website. They do have some great management resources. And I don't know if we really want to get into a lot of details on use of chemicals on controlling invasives. The difficult thing is being careful to make sure the chemicals are only affecting the species that you want it to affect. So remember, chemicals just if you're spraying something, it just kind of spreads out and can impact a lot of non-target species. So that's something to be very careful about. So in some cases, it might be where you're, cutting down a shrub and then painting the stump with some kind of chemical that would prevent the roots from continuing to sprout. So barberry, depending on where it is and what kind of equipment you have, you might be able to mow that with a brush hog or something similar. It takes numerous mowings to control something like that, but it can be done again if it's accessible and you have the equipment to do that. But I think my advice would be to look at the resources on the Lower Hudson Prism website, because they'll certainly have a lot of information about barberry. Anything to add to that, Mike?
No, I think you're right on.
Okay.
There's a question about what share of ash trees will die with the arrival of emerald ash borer, and how fast will the trees die off? So we believe that basically almost all of the trees, the ash trees, will probably die when emerald ash borer does find your area. It may take a year or a couple years for them to die off. It may take a year before you see symptoms of their being infected. But the hope is that not all of them will die. And there is research currently going on here in the Hudson Valley where scientists are trying to get people, first of all, not to cut down live ash trees prematurely, because the hope is that some of them may survive, and then to identify those living trees that have survived emerald ash borer so they can become the seed source for the next generation of ash trees in our forests. So the belief is that most of them will die, but the hope is that a few will remain and can become a new seed source for ash. Julie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, that was a really great explanation of that current research. If I'm remembering correctly, it's about 1 in 1,000 ash trees that'll survive and thrive in the face of emerald ash borer. They're called lingering ash, if you ever run across that term. And just to add to that, I think this is a moment for forest management in our area, just because the emerald ash borer is creating these pockets of mortality as the ash trees die off. So if you have ash trees that are dead or dying on your property, as Mike said, don't cut down the live ones. There might be a resistant one there somewhere. Um, and especially if you do cut them down, don't move the firewood. You could be spreading the infestation by doing that. But this is the time to get out there and start evaluating. Look at what you have in terms of species in your forest. How many ash trees do you have? Where are they? Because when they die, a lot more light reaches the forest floor because there's no tree canopy there anymore. And when that happens, often what you get is just this upsurge of invasives. Barberry will completely carpet the forest floor. So this is the time for you to be thinking about evaluating your forest and planning for what you're going to do when your ash trees die, or if they already have died, what are you going to do to try to keep the invasives from taking over? And that's something we'll talk about more next week as well.
Julie, how can you find a consulting forester who has the skill, experience, and interest in helping one manage one's forest to preserve its health, biodiversity, and ecological services, and who can guide one to those contractors who can do the necessary work economically?
That is a great question. There are consulting foresters in our area. The DEC has consulting foresters on staff, and there are also private individuals who have a business as a consulting forester. I think, and when we finish doing all 3 webinars, Mike and I are putting together a list of resources that we're going to send out with some reading materials and some websites and things that we think you'll find to be useful resources as you're working on stewardship of your forests. But I think just for now, the place that I would start is the Master Forest Owners program that Cornell Cooperative Extension spearheads. And they have a way you can just request a visit from a master forest owner. These are your peers. These are local folks who own forests and manage them. And they'll come out and do a walk and kind of look at what you have. So that would be my first suggestion. Is there anything you want to add to that, Mike?
Yeah, I think the other option or the other thing I would hope people would do as well would be to consult with, private foresters who have the experience in forestry practices, but to make sure that your interests are clearly upfront and keep putting your goals in front of the person so that they tailor their recommendations to your goals. The fact that they've done great amount of work in, commercial forestry practices doesn't mean they necessarily can't provide you with good information on practices that would also be useful to preserve biodiversity and ecological services and the like. I think it's important to make sure you keep putting your goals forward in order to make sure that they address your needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think historically, commercial forestry and foresters have really been trained to evaluate forests in terms of their economic value. How many board feet of timber, and how can you, select for the valuable timber species. So they might not necessarily be looking at it through the lens of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So as Mike said, be very clear about what you're looking at and think it through even before you talk to a forester. So you have a really clear idea of what your goals are and you can kind of guide the work in that direction.
Next week, we're going to talk about some written materials that can be used to help start to guide you in your path towards being a steward. And so there's lots of materials on the web and written materials in books that can also be used to help start you along your path.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's a follow-up question on the ash trees. So for ashes that do die and fall, can you please explain more why they should not be burned? Is this true even if it comes from your own property, so the wood won't be moved? And if it shouldn't be burned, what's the best practice once it falls and dies? So I'm not aware of a ban on burning ash trees, are you? There is a burn ban in effect right now, which is just the annual spring burn ban that takes place from March 15th to May 15th. And simply because that's the most flammable time in the forest before the trees leaf out the understory and the leaf litter is quite dry. So you might have, there's a lot more tendency for brush fires and woods fires. So that's the reason for the burn ban in the springtime. But as far as we're aware, there's no ban on burning ash trees. And there's no reason why, as long as you're not moving them from your property, there's no reason why that would be a problem that I can think of.
Yeah, you could certainly burn those trees that have been killed on your property. That's a fine way to utilize that wood. The wood itself can be used for lumber or other purposes as well. What you don't want to do is move those trees with the bark on them and potentially spread larvae or adults of the emerald ash borer as you're moving that wood around. So using
Right.
that wood on your own site is absolutely fine.
Yeah. So best practice once the tree dies and falls is to just leave it there. If it's across your driveway, I'd move it. But if it's just out in the woods, it's going to become habitat for a lot of microbial life and the detritivores that are going to be breaking that log down back into the soil. Once the tree is dead, it's no longer a host. Those insects need a live tree in order to be able to lay their eggs in and have them survive. So you can just leave those when they fall down.
A question about replanting shrubs. Someone is removing honeysuckle root balls, and would you recommend planting directly into the disturbed soil? Will the remnants of the honeysuckle root interfere with native shrubs establishing and growing?
I can't speak to that specifically, but I can tell you that invasive shrubs have really persistent root systems. When I moved into the house where I live now, there was a burning bush planted right by the front door. And I pulled that out and I hacked the stump out with a hatchet. And I pulled little shoots out of that flower bed for years after that. So there were still intact roots. Um, so I don't see why you can't just plant directly into the disturbed soil, but try to pull out as many of those roots as you can and then just get good at identifying little root sprouts and make that a fun spring activity is to go out and just keep pulling those out because they could persist for a while. But I think your plan to plant into the disturbed soil should work fine. You'll just have to keep an eye out for root sprouts from the honeysuckle.
Should we all be hunting deer if we care about forest regeneration? or is this something that needs to be resolved at the policy level? So the ability to hunt in certain areas is restricted because of safety issues. And so those areas, it's certainly not going to be normal hunting practices that are going to help to control deer. But where it is feasible and safe, regular hunting, controlled hunting programs can be very effective at helping to reduce deer numbers to the point where forest regeneration is feasible. It's something we need to address at all different levels, from the individual homeowner to the large landowner to the person in charge of policy at our various state and federal agencies. But so much of the natural habitats in New York and the Northeast are in the hands of private owners that we really have a responsibility to be deer managers as well as forest stewards. And so some form of regulated hunting has been proven to be the most cost-effective way to control deer numbers in those areas where hunting is feasible.
Okay, and it looks like there's just one more question. So is there any reason to not transplant native trees from one area where you don't want it to other places where you do want it? So this sounds like white pine seedlings being transplanted from a blueberry field to up near the road to create a living green barrier. Any thoughts on that?
I think I would be careful when I dug them up. You'd want them to be dormant. There may be soil issues up near the road with salt or with other mechanical things that the county does or the highway department does that could potentially kill or damage the trees. I don't see any, as long as it's your property and you really don't want them where they've established, if you get them early enough, I guess I don't see any reason why you shouldn't move them. What are your thoughts, Julie?
Yeah, I agree with that. And, as Mike said, just kind of evaluate the place where they're coming from and the place where they're going to, because depending on the soil type, the exposure to sun and things like that, if it's near the road, the salt would be a big issue. What's the ability of the plants to survive in the new location? White pines are pretty good at growing if you give them an opportunity. It's something you might want to put up a little barrier around them so the deer don't eat them. And after you've transplanted, certainly water them and look after them.
So I think we may have reached the end of the questions.
Yes, I think we got through them all.
So hopefully we'll see you all next week at 6 o'clock, where we'll start on the next section of our forest workshop. We will be sending out a link to tonight's recording for you if you're interested, or if you know someone who might be and you want to share it. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you for joining us.
Yep. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next week.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.